introduction of the audience. So we'll just go around the table and introduce ourselves and our affiliations. I'll start. I'm Jordan Hess from City Council.
Dave Strohmeyer, Missoula County Commissioner.
Ginny Merriam, Communications Director for the City of Missoula, sitting in for Mayor Engen.
Ed Taves, MDT.
Dudley Improda, representing the Planning Board.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Aaron Wilson with the Missoula Metropolitan Planning Organization.
Great. And we have Bert Caldwell and Shane Stack from MDT in the audience. We have minutes from January 16th, 2016. I'd entertain a motion to approve or amend those. Commissioner?
I would move that we approve the minutes.
Okay, is there a second? All right, it's been moved and seconded. Discussion or public comment? Okay, all those in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And opposed, no? Okay, those will be approved. Do we have any public comment? All right, seeing none, we have one item of new business, and that's the Pedestrian Facilities Master Plan update. And Aaron Wilson is here to present that item.
All right, thanks. This is just an update, kind of ongoing work that we've been doing on the Pedestrian Facilities Master Plan. We don't have any action that we're looking for TPCC to make today, so this will just be me going through a presentation and giving a quick update on what we've been working on and kind of what the direction we're headed.
Okay, and I'll just stop you for a second and note
Sure.
for the record that Don MacArthur and Commissioner Curtis are here. Carry on.
Thanks. It's cold out there too. So just kind of a refresher on where we're at in the project schedule. We've more or less wrapped up our existing conditions analysis, and that included doing our sidewalk inventory and the ADA facilities inventory and looking at some of the other data that we have available. We've been working for the last couple of months on coming up with some options for establishing priorities, and that's primarily what this presentation will be about and what we're taking to the public for this round of public involvement. From here, we're going to do some work on implementation strategies, which includes funding, where we allocate the limited funds that we have, how we can come up with new funding, and maybe some other implementation issues like design options and how we build sidewalks and where. And then the goal is to have this plan written and adopted sometime this summer, hopefully July. That's the goal, and we're more or less on track with our schedule, so I think that's good. We've got a couple of pieces of kind of the research that we've been doing, which includes some existing conditions, just an update on some of what we presented in the last update we gave. We did a bunch of research. This was kind of requested by our steering committee to look at what does affect or what kind of improvements have what effects on health and mode split and ADA accessibility and safety and those things. So we did a fair amount of research. There's a summary of that included in your packet. I won't go through all of it in a lot of detail other than pointing out with relation to health, there was some mixed findings, not necessarily bad, but looking at particularly the built environment and that, what impact does that have on physical activity? And what we found was physical activity for transportation tends to go up as you make improvements to the built environment, like adding in sidewalks, increasing accessibility, maybe increasing density, mixed use, those kinds of things that we think about as being part of the built environment. What was more uncertain was the overall physical activity improvements. And there was some research indicating that there wasn't a huge change, that people were doing more physical activity for transportation, but maybe less for recreation, or vice versa. What we also found was that there may be the socioeconomic piece, so the social factors may be just as critical. So that's the education and outreach, addressing things like poverty and access to those facilities might have an equally important role in increasing overall physical activity. In terms of achieving our mode split goals, as I mentioned, most of the research showed that if you increase facilities and the quality and access to those, that people will take more trips by walking. So the evidence there was more or less positive across the board, that if you make those improvements, people will walk more for transportation. In relation to the ADA, or accessibility and peoples with disabilities, there's a lot of evidence out there that having physical infrastructure that's not accessible or not present has an impact, obviously, on peoples with disability, and that they are more predisposed to having physical activity disparities compared to the general population or peoples without a disability. So it's critical to have accessible facilities so that those folks can get out and have access to the same kind of pedestrian infrastructure that everyone else has. And then related to safety, safety comes up a lot in terms of people's willingness or ability to walk around a city or a community. And that includes things like crossings, infrastructure, and generally reducing conflicts between pedestrians and motor vehicles. So nothing really surprising there, but there was, we found a fair amount of evidence showing that safety is a big barrier, or a perception of safety, and so that's something that we need to think about as we do this plan, and how do we address that in Missoula and make safety improvements or have people feeling comfortable out there walking. There's some good resources that we found in the research, so tables or references that we can use as we think about where to prioritize or how to prioritize in the sidewalk infrastructure. This is one example, kind of showing different types of characteristics in a neighborhood and what impact that has on physical activity amongst different ages of people. So you can see for transportation-related physical activity, particularly amongst adults, all of these things have significant improvements or impact on improving that physical activity. When we get to recreation or leisure physical activity, it's a different set of characteristics that have an impact on that. So, and then looking at, again, overall physical activity, so that if we want to really address obesity in our community, we're really looking at overall physical activity. And again, having some different kinds of facilities might have different impacts there. So we'll use all of this as we move forward, thinking about how we prioritize and what we're doing with our facilities master plan. I also wanted to give a quick update on our survey. We did close that back in December. We've started to look into those results a little bit more. Just wanted to show that we have a pretty good representation from around the city, with the notable exception that the north side, west side were very involved in this survey. But we do have representation from pretty much every neighborhood, and then other folks outside, either outside of the city or who didn't identify with a neighborhood. So again, good geographic representation in this survey. We received 559 responses, which is quite a few. So we can take that information and again apply it to what we're doing. We did want to look at some of the demographics, because one, we haven't gotten to analyzing the results by demographics yet, but I think it will be interesting to look at. Particularly looking at the distribution of responses by age. We had a pretty good, at least some representation of every age category. Most of the respondents were a little over 2/3 were female, which is interesting that women were more likely to respond to this survey or more interested in it. So that we can compare those results that way. Looking at people with disability, about 19% of our respondents reported having some physical disability, and the largest portion of that, or 7.9%, or about 8%, were people with a mobility-related disability. So again, we'll want to look at the results, because I think what people report as the largest barrier or necessary improvements will likely differ between those different demographic groups. And then we did look at race and ethnicity, and it matches pretty closely to Missoula's population, but with the overwhelming majority of responses being white or Caucasian. So which brings us to the results. Nothing has really changed since the preliminary, or the overall results haven't changed since what we presented at the last update. Basically, people are most concerned about busy streets. So whether that's not having enough safe places to cross, so this gets back to that research we found related to safety being critical to pedestrian environment, people driving too fast on busy streets, and then missing sidewalks or walking paths on busy streets. So clearly busy streets are people's biggest barrier to walking in Missoula, and so we need to think about that when we want to strategize how do we get more people walking for more of their trips. And then in terms of
I'm going to
Mo-
stop you for a second for a question,
Sure,
Don.
yeah.
Just if you could sort of tell us what the scale is on those bars, like is there any statistical significance between the difference in the length of those bars, or are they all?
It's just the number of responses that listed those as the primary barrier, or I'm trying to think of what that scale is.
What's the difference between the shortest and the longest on that?
Oh,
number
right.
of responses.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it probably depends on how wide you make that graph. I'd have to look. I can look at that and get back to you.
Okay.
And get the scale difference. And then as far as improvements, streets where pedestrians have been injured or killed was the highest rated response for improvements. Again, getting back to that safety aspect. And then there are some equity importance in there, that areas that serve low income and transit dependent populations. And then kind of back to busy streets, so along and across busy streets, and then streets connecting families and children to schools. So I think fairly consistent results to what we would expect to hear from people based on the research and based on what we see in other communities. Any questions on that?
Commissioner Strohmeyer.
So the categories that are listed here, were those ones that were self-reported by respondents, or those were ones that you provided? And
these were what we provided as options. So it's possible that there is a need that people have that wasn't represented on our list of questions. We took this survey, we modified it from one that other communities have used to try to be somewhat consistent and compare, between other communities. And so we didn't just arbitrarily come up with all of these things on our own.
And could folks select as many as they wanted, or did they have to pick the top 3 or top 1, or?
That's a good question. It's been a long time since I've looked at that survey.
Because I could see,
yeah,
just going through the list, thinking those all look pretty important. So.
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, let me look into that and get back to you. I want to say that people could pick the top, or rank them, but it's possible that people could respond equally to each one, and so we're getting, generally people think all of these are important, but, by and large, these are the most important.
Don?
Are these all of the questions or things they could have filled out as responses, or are there a bunch of other ones that aren't on
No,
the graphic?
these are all of them.
Okay.
These are all of the options, yeah. And we'll put some of these results up on our website with a little bit more detail especially once we dive into looking at differences between, demographics and how they would respond to these questions. So given all of that data with the existing conditions and the research and the surveys, the question is kind of what do we do with all of that, or what are we doing with all of that? And this is kind of the phase we're in now, where we're taking all of that information and first starting to look at priority areas, so establishing where we think the highest priority for improvements in the pedestrian network are. So we know we have limited funding, and we have a lot more need than we can afford currently. So how do we prioritize where those investments go? And then looking at identifying safety and accessibility improvements. So where, again, do we prioritize those kinds of improvements to get the most benefit for our investment? And then thinking about some policy recommendations and how can we change how we're currently doing business or improving the pedestrian network in Missoula. So in terms of prioritization, we've come up with 5 options that we're taking out to the public and different groups for feedback in terms of how we prioritize. You have a packet in your handout that has a map of each one of those different models or options. And we kind of created those on starting with sort of 2 polarized opposite ends, one being kind of the equity side, the socioeconomic data, so that's things like places with higher concentrations of people with disability, or older adults, or low-income neighborhoods. So that would be one end. The other end is the physical and built environment. So we came up with a set of data that we thought was representative of the places people would walk to or from. So that includes things like parks, schools, bus stops, residential and employment density, and all of that. So those are the two sort of polar opposites that we started with. So there's one option that just looks at socioeconomic data, one option that just looks at the physical built environment. And then we came up with three kind of representative options that were in between those two ends. So one that combined socioeconomic and the physical built environment, but weighted the socioeconomic more heavily, kind of a 50-50 split, and then again another that weighted the physical environment higher than the socioeconomic data. So that's kind of the general approach we took to come up with these 5 options, because primarily we wanted to see how does it change the map when you weight those things differently. And these were sort of in-between ways we could look at that. Not to say that any of these will be the final map that we come up with, but we thought it was instructive in terms of getting feedback on what's most important to people. So we broke up our data into those 2 categories. So there's the socioeconomic data, and we had 5 data sets that we included there. Those low to moderate income, obesity, 0-car households, disability, and people age 65 and older. And we identified areas that had higher concentrations of each of those things. And on all of these options, we had a maximum score of 100. So, and we weighted each data set equally in every option. Well, under each category, each data set is weighted equally. So for example, in the socioeconomic data, if you took just that data for one option, each one of those would get a total of 20 points possible. Does that make sense to folks? So then with the physical built environment, we had schools, transit stops. We, in consultation with our steering committee and talking with Mountain Line, we only included high ridership stops as an initial. When we looked at all transit stops around the city and looking at a quarter-mile walking distance from those, it basically was the whole city, and so it doesn't really help you prioritize certain areas. So this was one way that we could use that data to further refine, where might we invest most heavily. We also included grocery stores, parks, commuter paths, post offices, medical clinics, nursing homes, emergency support services, so things like emergency food, shelter, and substance abuse. And then religious civic hall, so places that people typically congregate, whether it's for a meeting or religious or just civic participation. And then for residential and employment density, we looked at areas with greater than or equal to 7 households per acre being the highest scoring, so possibility of 25 points. We also included some slightly less dense areas just to get a little bit more refinement in the map, so places that had between 4 and 7 households per acre. And again, we pulled those numbers generally from the research on what does it take to be a walkable higher density, or what's the low end of a walkable neighborhood in terms of density. And the 7 households per acre seem to be kind of in that range. For employment, we looked at blocks that had greater than or equal to 12 jobs per acre. And again, that kind of came from the research, and also some research on transit ridership and what employment density it takes to get higher transit ridership, and thinking that those two could be kind of correlated. So any questions on this before? This is kind of a lot of information and maybe a little complicated math.
One question I have, first I want to give a little shout out to my neighbors on the west side for being really good at taking surveys, apparently. A question I had, I guess, was about if you plan to adjust the model to sort of alter the size of census blocks or block groups that are artificially large. Like the one that stands out to me immediately is the Lewis and Clark housing by the university, that where there's a fairly high residential density, but it looks like it's spread over the golf course as well, which gives. And I'm sure that there are several of those through the community where there's a group home or some sort of facility that is or a large multifamily or maybe outlying commercial where there is a use that's a generator that's on a large block group, I guess. Is there any thought of identifying those and altering the map
Yeah, we could definitely look at doing that. I mean, for this first round, we didn't. We were trying to keep it as straightforward and simple as possible without having to go through each block and look at what was actually there and whether we adjust. But if there are some of those specific, like the Lewis and Clark villages, where maybe that block includes some large open space, and so it looks artificially low in terms of density, when in fact where the residential is high density, we can definitely start to look at those and make those adjustments. We've been working with the long range planning folks to get updated building permit data, so we can get more recent numbers in terms of density. So things like the mill site that aren't currently in our data in our model, we want to add that in because that neighborhood is pretty high density residential, and I don't think it's showing up as such currently, just because the data we have is a couple years old and there's been a lot of activity out there. So we're kind of actively working to update that as we go. But part of this process is getting that feedback of if there are blocks that should be higher density because they're just artificially large, but there's a high concentration of residential there, we would want to know that so we can make an adjustment.
Thanks. Done.
So the only way that these maps demonstrate the sort of pieces that might be filled in is through the missing sidewalk data. Is that right? Because as I read their survey responses, there were, one of the top survey responses was poor crossings of busy streets. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm wondering, like, part of what I want to see is these areas fleshed out more in their needs, so that you could then sort of see which of these covers the needs better somehow. I'm trying to meld these things together. When I just see the area in red, I then think, well, is there anything needed there? If it's a high priority to meet the socioeconomic model, but there's really no needs out there, then it doesn't show anything that useful. So there's one more piece of data I think missing, which is what are the sort of known needs, what are our goals there that we think could address the maybe survey results or the will of the community, and then sort of be able to see those in the map form too, to overlay the three things.
Yeah,
It's complicated.
I think I'll get to some of that. Maybe let's hold that thought and we'll come back to it, because I think I'll get to, especially related to the safety improvements in the crossings, because that does factor in a little bit differently. So when we're thinking about this prioritization, this is primarily for new or maybe repaired sidewalks. So we've had a lot of these conversations about, well, what are we prioritizing? What kind of improvements? So I'll get to some of that in a minute and how that relates to this prioritization.
So that's really all that you're looking at is the sidewalk repair piece. How would we allocate our limited dollars toward that?
Or new sidewalks, sure, yeah. Because that question has come up a lot. The city has, the sidewalk funds and puts those toward, the question has come up, how do we decide where to build those new sidewalks? And this is one effort we've made to try to come up with a process to do that, that is based on data, the things that we know based on research affects how much or people's ability to walk. So that's where we're getting at, your destinations and attractors, and then also the equity piece, and then how much do you weight those things?
Commissioner?
So are you also, and I know you've done an inventory, so you probably know where those cuts need to be and those kinds of things, but I mean, if we built a really nice sidewalk and put it to an intersection that was too busy to cross and you didn't have time and the traffic was too fast and all that stuff, it's kind of a waste of time too. So how do you, I think it's kind of what you're saying too, is how do you identify those, because this probably needs to be coordinated with street work, not just sidewalk work.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And I've got some more discussion of that a little bit further into the presentation.
Commissioner Schneemeyer?
Yeah, and so just to be clear, even though it's missing sidewalks that are depicted on the maps, we're really talking about pedestrian facilities more broadly, I would think, and that there could very well be areas, maybe not so much in the urban core, but there might be areas where a shared use path or some other pedestrian facility might be lacking but more appropriate than a traditional sidewalk. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, definitely. I mean, some of these, what we call missing sidewalk is essentially a street that doesn't have a facility today. So, we're calling it missing sidewalks. Maybe it should be missing pedestrian facilities, because outside, like you mentioned, outside the urban core, maybe up the Rattlesnake or other places, a different kind of facility would be more appropriate. And it's something that we'll also be working on, I think, at future stages. What is the right facility for different contexts? Because I think that's a key question that we're trying to look at, of how do we maximize our investment, and that's one way to do it. Any other questions? So just have some examples of what the data looks like before it goes into this model. So for the socioeconomic data, most of this is at the census block group or census tract geography. So this example here is rates of adult obesity. So you can see that the areas that are identified as higher rates of obesity are fairly large geographic areas. So there's not a whole lot of refinement there in terms of very specific locations, but we can start to see which neighborhoods or areas have those pieces. And the way we did this, so our analysis we did at the block level, so census block. It's essentially, in the city, it's an actual city block. As you get further out into the county, those get a little bit larger and differently shaped. But by and large, we did it at the block scale. And so every block that intersects one of these areas was scored for having that particular socioeconomic piece.
Go ahead. Does that coordinate household income in those same blocks as well, too? Or do you have that overlay?
We do have that. So we use low to moderate income, and we scored that one a little bit differently. So it was a range. It was the one that made them, because, when you set up a class for some of those, particularly the low to moderate income, we found there were a lot of block groups that were just under or just over a class. And so it was hard to figure out where to set that cutoff of, what constitutes low to moderate income. And so we basically had a range and then just multiplied that percentage by the points, so the 20 points. And so you would get, the higher low to moderate income block groups scored higher in that particular category.
Thank you.
Yeah. So for the physical built environment, we took a 1/4 mile buffer of all of our attractors, so things like parks, schools, transit stops, nursing homes, as that being kind of the general rule of thumb for what's considered a walkable distance, particularly related to transit or walking to school or work. And then we scored any block that intersected with those buffers. So this is an example of the high ridership transit stops. So any block that was within a 1/4 mile of that high ridership transit stop would receive those points. And again, we didn't weight any of these differently. That's something that we're taking feedback on, and we're hoping to get more input on, which of these data sets or which of these factors is most important to people. We've heard some evidence that maybe schools and transit and parks are more important than some of the other destinations, and so we can take all that information and adjust the model and score a little bit differently based on those preferences.
Do you recall what the threshold was for high ridership?
That was the top quartile, so the highest 25% or the highest quarter of stops.
Thanks.
Does that make sense?
Did you include private facilities like the Clark Fork School as well?
Yeah, the private schools, so all the schools are in there. Yep. So looking at, again, the residential and employment density, we broke each block down based on the number of jobs per acre and the number of households per acre, and then gave points accordingly if that block had either high employment, high residential, or both. And you can see most places there, it's either high residential or high employment. The exception would be kind of the downtown area and some of the inner core. Often you'll have blocks that have both high employment and residential. So this gets us into our, excuse me, the 5 models or 5 options we came up with. These will look a little bit different than the maps that you have. The only difference is I've taken out some of these open lands blocks because they just kind of muddy the waters a little bit when you're looking at those maps, particularly the ones that are, like Mount Sentinel, which is really close to the university, and it just happens to be, the edge of that block is within a quarter mile of a lot of things, but there's nothing up there, so we're not going to be building sidewalks or lots of pedestrian facilities in our open lands. That's sort of a different program, recreational trails, and not really what this plan is getting at. So the socioeconomic model, we took those 5 data sets, looked at where they overlap and which blocks have higher percentages of each of those groups. So you can see, downtown score is fairly high, and this is something we saw throughout, is that downtown has lots of high density jobs, residential, and lots of densities of things, and potentially vulnerable populations. Also saw some higher priority areas in the Franklin to the Fort and the north side, west side. So then we can compare that with just looking at the physical built environment, and you see a lot more, I guess refinement is one word, but each block is there's a lot of variability from block to block based on how close that block is to those destinations. But we still see some concentrations of, particularly again in the Franklin to the Fort, River Road, north side, west side. So we see sort of similar patterns, but it's a little bit more, variable block to block. So then when we start to combine these and look at, both socioeconomic and the physical built environment, it, changes based on those 2 factors. But by and large, we found that the priority areas stayed relatively consistent, with some variability in terms of, where in Franklin to the Fort was showing up as the highest priority versus other places. So those are the 5 options that we've developed that we're taking feedback on. So that brings us to the next question, which I think Jean and Don, you were asking about. What about the safety and accessibility piece? Does that fit in the same way as, say, a new sidewalk segment? On these previous options, we can look at where we have missing sidewalks, where the highest priority areas would be. We could then invest in building new sidewalks in those highest priority areas. But for safety and accessibility, those high priority areas might not be the same as a new, whole block of sidewalk, for instance. So we started looking at some other ways to think about that particular kind of infrastructure improvement. And one, what we've seen from the research and from the surveys is that high volume and high speed roadways are a huge barrier to people walking. And so looking at the volumes and the speeds around Missoula can help us identify where we would need those improvements. And then looking where we have existing crossings, or start identifying places where we have crashes or high rates of pedestrian crashes, and use this as a different way to prioritize those kinds of improvements. So does that kind of get at we don't have an answer yet of how we would do that. It's something that we've been kind of questioning and looking into different ways we might do that. And part of it comes down to how do you divide up your available funding between the different kinds of improvements you could make. So there's new sidewalks, repaired sidewalks, ADA improvements, safety improvements, and each of those might look a little bit different depending on how much you invest in each one.
Is there a mechanism to standardize these data based on usage or anything? I'm looking at downtown has a lot of dots, but it also has significantly more pedestrians than other areas. So have you thought about that?
It's really hard to do because we just don't have pedestrian volume data like we do for motor vehicles.
Yeah.
We're kind of getting there. We have our volunteer counts. We can use that on some facilities. We can look at getting some approximate rates of crashes based on volumes, but it's going to be a pretty rough estimate compared to, we do so many motor vehicle counts. Every year we can get a pretty good idea of crash rates, but we just can't do it with bicycle and pedestrian data yet. So,
Don?
So these models look at kind of blending these two different sets of criteria, and I wonder whether it would be better to, instead of trying to make one map that blends the two criteria, if we kept those two criteria completely separate and identified separate funding amounts for the two.
Yeah, I think that's...
So let me just spin that out in my brain a little bit. I mean, it seems like if we hybridize the two things, you might end up not doing the best for either. And maybe instead you should take the money and say, okay, we're going to take the top project off the attractor generator thing and do it. And we're going to spend 50% of our money this year doing the top attractor generator project and 50% doing the top socioeconomic project. So it might not get blended in this map and into one set of criteria, but maybe it's a separation of the money, somehow indicating that some portion of the money should go to each. Because it feels like as we blend, we might not be quite hitting the best use of either.
Yeah, let me...
So maybe you've thought this all through already and have a way to guide us.
I don't think we have a way to guide you yet. We've asked the questions for sure, and have been asked the questions a lot. So one way to think about this, just jumping ahead a little bit, we have these maps prioritizing different areas, then we get into the funding, and maybe these things are swapped. So we look at the funding, and that's like kind of the next step in our process. So we haven't really gotten there yet and thought, or developed some recommendations on how we would break that funding down by the different types of improvements. But that seems to be the big question is, how much should we invest in new sidewalk versus ADA improvements versus sidewalk repairs versus safety or crossing improvements. So that's kind of one question. And then once you've identified that split, how do you prioritize each of those? And I think, you're right, those will likely look a little bit different. So we have a map of all of our ADA improvement or existing curb cuts, whether those are, up to current ADA standards or not. We know where they are and generally how old they, what type of curb cut, whether it has truncated domes or sort of an older style that doesn't really meet current standards. So we can use that map and then look at different areas and, start potentially filling in the gaps in a different way than we would with new sidewalks. But it may be that those priority areas are the same for new sidewalk and ADA improvements, but that's something we're trying to get some more input on because there's no clear, easy answer. So any input you have would be very helpful for us at this stage. But that's kind of the process we're looking at is, identify our different funding pots and the different types of projects, and then use these prioritization maps, whether it's the priority areas or, looking at identifying specific barriers based on speed and volume and crash history. So those are two separate ways that you can prioritize different pots of money. Does that make sense?
So I don't know if this is appropriate before people have thought it through themselves, if maybe everyone has, but for myself, when I looked at your presentation, I think that there is a strong logic to what sort of comes out in the attractor generator model of making the arterials, pedestrian arterials as well, and fully functional, that connect the big picture of the community, all for the main places in the community together as a first step. And it's a whole system. It's not orphaned pieces of sidewalk that don't allow you to connect to a whole nother neighborhood. So to me, that seems like first order of business is we get the arterials fixed, the crossings fixed. That deals with safety. It deals with the big picture connectivity throughout the community. Then I look at your maps though, and I think, well, is that fair to all people? Is that actually addressing the neighborhoods that are disadvantaged? And then I think, well, that's where I want to allocate that every year we're not just doing the arterial connection that makes the whole thing come together, but we're also allocating some portion toward filling in gaps in the most needy neighborhoods. So that's where I came up with the money idea, that we, maybe we just allocate every year that some percentage of the money, or we're going to take on X amount of sidewalks for the purposes of addressing the socioeconomic model.
I do like your idea of maintaining those in some respect as discrete criteria that can be looked at apart from one or the other. It's a good point. Commissioner Curtis.
I thought it was also interesting, if you could go back to the little quarter-mile circles. Because in some ways, if you look at that, I thought that was interesting that everything is kind of it's more condensed than I would have thought. But, I mean, those might be the ones that then you take the yellow dots that just showed the barriers and, identify and focus some of the money, as Don was saying.
Yeah, and this is just transit. So, each of the, as a representation of what the data looks like, at our meeting tomorrow, we'll have a map for each one of these data sets. And you can see, different, if you're looking at just schools, those look different in terms of what's a quarter mile from a school. And a lot of those happen to be in primarily residential neighborhoods. So it might look very different. And, ultimately when you get to looking at all of those things, you can kind of see the places that have high concentrations of places that you might walk to, like school and work and bus stops and parks and trails and all of those things. So,
because I think in regard to socioeconomic, we should also look at some of the facilities that serve our folks in that realm. So the food bank, for example, doesn't have a good bus, doesn't have good sidewalks. It does in front of it, but not to get to it. Same with Partnership Health Center and the health department. I mean, places, the library, where people may not have a car, so should be able to get there in a better way.
So I have another observation about the transit piece, I guess, which is that, I mean, it with a few exceptions, it very clearly mirrors the high-frequency transit network. And so as Mountain Line adds additional high-frequency service on Brooks or in other areas, how does the model adjust? Or what do you think is the approach to accommodate future transit development?
Yeah,
and I guess kind of in the context of, with our current funding, we're going to build out our sidewalk network in 140 years, or I mean, I don't remember.
Right.
It's a long time. And so prioritize, looking out to transit service that might exist in 10 years is not unreasonable, I guess.
Yeah, and after we put this data together, we started thinking about, well, are the high ridership stops just the places that have good access already? And you're right, it's primarily along the 15-minute routes with a couple of exceptions, in different locations. But it'd be interesting to know that whether or not those stops are high ridership because they have good sidewalk or pedestrian facilities already. And that is another way that we could evaluate transit stops versus, how do we prioritize transit stops even within this model? Is there something that we can look at in our data that tells us what gets high ridership at a stop? And is there something we can do in the pedestrian realm that would help facilitate that? Or even thinking ahead to, where's Mountain Line planning to do high frequency service in the future, and do we have good pedestrian facilities there? Because it's likely to change ridership as those frequencies change. So making sure that we're trying to keep up with Mountain Line's changes in frequency and having good facilities to those stops. So, yeah.
Thanks.
I'd make another point about the socioeconomic model. That what's the median house price in Missoula now? $279 or something. So if we're really trying to serve a diverse population, the idea of sidewalks in single-family neighborhoods is important, but in the future, those are not going to be attainable for most people who don't have a fair amount of means. So I guess my point in that is that I think that is going to mean more dense housing along our arterials, which also supports the idea of making strong pedestrian facilities along those arterial areas that allow for higher density. So although it may not look like a great initial investment for socioeconomic purposes, I think in the long term it will be.
James?
Yeah, I'd be interested, in, maybe not in this meeting, but in future meetings, to understand how this is going to match into the long-term plan. From what I understand, getting my TPCC orientation, the long-term goal is to reduce single-car ridership from, 70-some% down to 30%. And this plan has to integrate very heavily into supporting that all the way, and it needs to start now because that's a pretty audacious goal to hit in the next, 30 years. So, and it seems like a long ways away, but I really want to understand how this plan integrates into that and is planning for that desire or that eventuality, because that's going to really impact, pedestrians, health, all that kind of stuff from that access. And if we're looking at socioeconomic models, the lower income and disabled communities are going to have to be able to reach all of their assets, probably through being able to walk. So that's going to be really important, talking about the food bank and public health and all that. That's going to be probably the most vital thing to build out, is those direct connections from being able to walk from where you live to those services.
Yeah, and that's, again, when we're looking at the research, looking specifically at, what's most likely to change people's trips versus increase or decrease their physical activity, and the built environment is really critical to achieving that mode split goal. So we definitely view this as, we have to get this at least on the right track if we're going to achieve that goal, and that should be a big piece of this. And that was one of the reasons we included some of the destinations we did, such as like schools, and ensuring that there are safe routes to schools, because that sets sort of a lifelong habit. And there's some evidence that shows if you can get kids walking to school in elementary or younger ages, that they continue that on later in life. And so making sure that you have those connections is really important, and one of the reasons we included that in the physical built environment pieces. Same with transit, to make sure people have access to transit and that's a viable option for them. So yeah, I think you're right, and that these infrastructure plans or facility plans are going to be really critical to achieving that mode split goal in the future.
Commissioner Strohmeyer?
So how, if at all, does land use factor into any of this? Because clearly the socioeconomic model and a tractor generator is based on current conditions, but zoning or growth policy could potentially shift some of the priorities, and that would truly be looking to the future, as opposed to, and that's not to diminish the importance of any deficiencies right now, but certainly looking into the future. I don't know how that would be factored into this, but it seems like it ought to some extent.
Yeah, we have land use maps that show density, and if there's a preference for making sure we have good pedestrian facilities in places that we're planning for higher density, we can add that data into this and include it in the scoring, or give it some weight based on how important we think that is in relation to other things. One of the challenges with this process is the more things you pull into it, the less obvious it becomes when you see the results. Things just get, you get a little bit here, a little bit there, and then the whole map basically looks the same. I think if we were to look at, any one of these priority areas and then look at our land use maps, they would match up reasonably well. Like if you think about where we have zoned or land use for higher density usage, it's Franklin to the Fort, North Side, West Side, downtown, Brooks Corridor, some of these places that are showing up as high priorities in the models. So I think we're already, the places where we've identified for higher density already have a certain amount of that happening, and we could certainly add in those future plans and factor that in as well. I think it's a good thought. We should at least be looking at that and seeing how they match up. For sure.
James, did I cut you off earlier? I looked like you might have had a follow-up.
I have a bigger question.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So on the pedestrian injury crash data from there, is there any seasonality to that? So that would be something I'd really like to see mapped over that, because, I mean, it can tie into when we need to do use, when we need to do high use, and that could help with budgeting and organizing resources in the future, because if it's seasonal to, tourist season or summer or whatever, there's ways to modify and organize those environments, even on a seasonal basis, to decrease injury as well, so.
Yeah, we have contributing, we have time, day, contributing causes for most of these crashes, so we can start to look at that, and I think that will be part of this plan, is looking at what's causing the crashes and how can we address those. Is it infrastructure related, or is it maintenance or safety crossing?
I just can't resist saying that amazingly all the places that are designated as higher density and have lacking infrastructure are also the lower socioeconomic, because they don't organize quite as well as people who live in the university.
Yeah, I think as we went through this, one of our goals was to make sure we weren't looking at the map and then adjusting it based on where we thought we should make improvements. We wanted to see kind of what the data would tell us as far as what the high priority areas are, because I think that's instructive to take out kind of we want to make sure the low income neighborhoods see, we want to see more priority there, and sort of adjusting your data and your scoring to get that. We sort of wanted to see what it would look like, just, kind of leaving all of that out. And I think what we're seeing is some of those areas, like particularly Franklin to the Fort, North Side, West Side, River Road neighborhood, end up being higher priority because of the data that you're selecting, but also because they have higher densities and they have a lot of transit and schools, and there are a lot of those things in those neighborhoods too. So there could be some value to making investments there.
Move along?
Yeah, I've got just a couple more slides here. I think we've covered most of it. Related to the safety and non-building new sidewalk infrastructure, we've found some helpful tools out there. This was some FHWA guidance on what kind of improvements you might want to consider or definitively include in an improvement based on a roadway's volumes and speed and width. So in this chart, you can kind of take your street. If it has 9,000 or less than 9,000 vehicles a day, 35 miles an hour, and it's 3-lane, it gives you sort of a menu of these are the kinds of improvements you should think about doing. And so this is something we're looking at trying to include in the plan, so that when we come up with these projects, we're making the right improvements and not missing something or doing substandard safety improvements, or just as a way to kind of identify what we should do to make the pedestrian network more accessible to people. So I think there's a lot of information like this out there already that we can use and pull into the plan to help us make those decisions. Maybe not necessarily on exactly where to do it, but once we identify those locations, we can come up with the right design to make an encouraging pedestrian network. So I've kind of gone over this. So that the next step after we sort of get some input and solidify how we want to prioritize different areas, particularly for new sidewalks or different kinds of improvements. The next question is really that funding piece. So how do you allocate limited funds between all of these different kinds of needs? And so that will be one of our next challenges, is getting some feedback on some recommendations on how we could do that the same or differently, or maybe look at funding sources differently so we can maximize the potential for a pedestrian network. And then ultimately we have to select projects from those areas. So having some kind of criteria, none of these decisions are going to give us a list of projects necessarily, but it will give us really clear guidance on kind of where that investment should occur. And then we'll have to pick projects based on the available funding, other barriers or limitations or potential future development. I think there are a list of other criteria that would go into picking, the 5-year capital improvement program, or identifying which projects we would pursue grants for, things like that. So that kind of wraps up what we have so far, and it's a lot of information, and we're really looking for the kind of input you've given today on how can we refine this or do it a little bit better, or change weights, change the data we're looking at, things like that. We will have all of this information up on our website. We have a public meeting tomorrow where we're going to start to explore some of these questions a little bit more in depth with the public and get some of their feedback on what are the places that people walk to, what are their priorities, do these models make sense, how can we change them to be more effective or efficient. And then if we're just missing something, because we're not perfect, so if there's really critical pieces that we need to include in this, we definitely want to do that. So yeah, the public meeting is tomorrow at the food bank from 5:30 to 7:30, and we have some activities and some opportunities to provide comments. So if anyone's interested or wants to participate or just see what people say, that'll be a good opportunity. And then we'll put as much of that up on the website and hopefully have the same opportunities for people to respond to those questions through the website, because not everyone can make it to a in-person meeting for one reason or another. So, any questions? Any more questions, I should say?
Okay. Would anyone from the audience like to comment on the process, or come on up?
Hi, my name is Doug Odegaard, and thank you for your work on this plan. One area specifically I wanted to point out is the lower portions of the map. I didn't see any inclusion with the Lower Miller Creek area. We have a new school going in down there, and so that portion from Linda Vista to Big Fork really needs to be looked at, and that's something that I've been trying to get information from city streets from Kevin Slovard, but even from your end, that'll be one of those. I don't want to see crash data down there. So, but yeah, that portion, I just didn't see much inclusion on the maps in the study.
Yeah,
so.
That'll be included in all of those maps. This is part of it's being able to show what it looks like in the scale on a presentation, but we'll have those areas included.
And then just second question, was it challenging for you to get data for this study or the information? Was that challenging for your team to get that information?
I think it depends on the data.
Okay.
But most of what we have here was fairly readily available.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks. Anyone else? And any additional comment from the committee? Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say that I meant to and didn't, but I wanted to welcome our two new members and give you an opportunity to introduce yourself if you'd like, and I guess we could even I don't know, James, do you want to introduce yourself and
Sure, I'm James Stevens. I'm the appointee to the TPCC board as a non-voting member from the Missoula County Public Health Board. Yeah, Board of Health. So I'm an appointee to the Board of Health, so I'm the representative at this meeting.
Great, thank you. And Dudley?
Dudley Improda. I'm retired from the university and also worked with the Avalanche Center here for about 15 years. Retired from that as well. I'm on the planning board and local emergency planning committee, and so doing my civic duty in my retirement. I told them I'd participate in this as well.
Excellent. Well, it's good to have both of you, and welcome aboard, and I'm sure you'll find it to be compelling, and there's always something interesting. And if you made it this far, you're probably drawn to these issues, so that's good. So I know that Aaron has an announcement. Well, you already made the announcement, but about the workshop. Do you want to say anything else about that?
No, I think
Okay.
just anyone who's interested should make it tomorrow at the food bank.
Okay, great. Any other closing comments? Okay, seeing none, thank you, everyone, and we will be adjourned.